Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this lovely event. It's always great to meet for positive news as opposed to otherworldly disappointing news. So congratulations, Cecily. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. Even though we're in a digital event, it's still important to recognize that we are in a digital territorial land acknowledgement, if I may. So we would like to acknowledge that while Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located. McGill University continues to be located on the traditional territory of the Guénette, or Mohawk Nation, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. Just because we seed our spaces of physical gathering during the pandemic, we have not unseated them yet. I'm joining you technically from Quebec City, but in reality from Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I am during the pandemic. So we gather from all across the world. Je vais dire quelques mots en français pour le début de la séance. Donc d'abord, je vous remercie de nous rejoindre pour cet heureux événement virtuel qui célèbre la publication du livre de Madame Cecily Rayner, qui est professeure adjointe d'études hispaniques et d'humanité numérique à l'Université McGill. Je présenterai les participants de l'événement en anglais, puis je passerai le micro à Leila et à Catalina, qui géreront la période de discussion d'environ 40 minutes. Vous avez accès aussi à Lidia, Ponce de la Vega, qui s'occupe de gérer la période de questions dans Zoom et sur YouTube et Twitter et Facebook. Donc, c'est un vrai événement virtuel dans tous les sens du terme. Les questions peuvent être transmises sur n'importe lequel de ces plateformes, mais n'hésitez pas à utiliser le clavardage de Zoom. So again, in English, you may ask questions at any time during the event, though we ask that you leave your microphones closed, off, but feel free to write up your question in the chat, and Lidia will ensure that at some point, someone addresses your question. So I will introduce the various speakers of the event today. So first off, let's start with Ms. Lidia Ponce de la Vega. She will be regulating questions in the chat. So Lidia is a PhD candidate in Hispanic Studies at McGill University. She's currently working on her doctoral thesis, which explores the Biodiversity Heritage Library, a vast digital archive from an eco-critical post-colonial perspective. Maybe we should ask Lydia some questions as well during the event. Our star this evening is Dr. Cecily Rayner. She's an assistant professor of Hispanic Studies and Digital Humanities at McGill University. She works on contemporary Latin American literature, digital literature, e-lit or e-literature, and computational humanities, and currently serves as graduate program director for digital humanities at McGill. In addition to Latin American literature at the Millennium Local Lives Global Spaces, she is co-editing a volume on digital culture in Latin America, which will be released by the University of Toronto Press in early 2022. You're very busy, Cecily. Our discussants today are Leila Lennon and Catalina Quesada-Gómez. So Leila Lennon is an associate professor of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies and Chair of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies at Brown University. Professor Lennon's research, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, please tell me afterward. Professor Lennon's research and teaching areas lie primarily in contemporary Brazilian and Latin American literature. Of particular interest to her is the intersection between social justice and cultural production. She has published on topics such as the representation of human rights in contemporary Afro-Brazilian literature, memory, literature, and Brazil's military dictatorship, and the interface between citizenship and literature. She is the author of Citizenship and Crises in Contemporary Brazilian Literature, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. Our second discussant, Catalina Quesada-Gómez, is a lecturer in Spanish at the University of Miami. Prior to her time at UMiami, she served as an assistant professor at the University of Bern in Switzerland. Her research examines topics related to the cultural dynamics of globalization, and its impact on the Hispanic world as they relate to 20th and 21st century Latin American literature and culture, particularly contemporary Colombian narrative, the Neo-Baroque, and Mexican and Cuban studies. Professor Quesada-Gómez is co-editor of the collection Cámara de Eco, Homenaje a Severo Sarduy, I hope I pronounced that correctly, by Mexico's Fondo de Cultura Económica in 2018. So I will now pass the microphone to our discussants, Leila and Catalina, and I'll remain in the room for if anyone needs anything translated in French through the chat, by all means, let me know.
So I don't know, Leila, do you want to go first? Ok, donc merci beaucoup Marie-France de la présentation. Bonsoir à tout le monde, merci d'être ici. Je suis très ravie d'avoir l'opportunité d'être aujourd'hui à Montréal, même si ce n'est que virtuellement. Donc je tiens à remercier chaleureusement Cecily et Ingrid pour l'invitation à présenter le livre de Cecily. Un livre que je dois le dire est magnifique, est vraiment magnifique. Je ne vais pas parler en français, mais je voulais juste dire quelques mots pour notre public francophone. So as you can imagine from its title, if you haven't read her book yet, Cecily's book outlines the relationship between globalization and literature in Latin America, focusing on the local, in my opinion, offers a key contribution to the field of globalization studies. And it has the added value of including both the Hispanic and the Portuguese-speaking areas. So let's start by saying this book explores how, I'm going to put that in a very simple word. The book explores how literature in Latin America discusses and codifies the experience of change that globalization implies, and which is the place for local issues in this landscape. So Cecily studies new modalities of the local through close reading of the text to see how contemporary Latin American authors from across the region negotiate localizing practices within an increasingly destabilized and globalized spatial system. And those are her works. I like very much the way she explores how practices of locality mark the cultural production of this area, because this is something I have also explored in my own research. So I was very interested when I had the pleasure of reading the book. I think that nobody saw the book, it's here. It was my pleasure to read the book and see how interesting things he was saying in it. So I think that one of the many accomplishments of this book is to show that the local, the concept of local is not a fixed concept, but a changeable one. Okay, so we can discuss later on that. I'm particularly impressed by the skill with which Cecily manages the transition between the different stages of her argument, as well as by her success in never losing sight of her thesis, even as she pursues detailed different readings of individual works and passages. I also like the fact that the book is theoretically sophisticated without being pretentious. So the author's theses are conveniently supported by some of the fundamental critics in this area, such as Santiago Castro-Gómez, Néstor García-Canclini, Jesus Martín Barbero, among many, many others. But this presence is never overwhelming. So as you can see, if you have the book, in the extensive bibliography demonstrates clearly that the author has an excellent command of the material she discussed. I found that some of the strengths of this book are, first, the detailed knowledge of the text discussed, as well as of the theoretical and literary framework with which these texts are written. Second, the equity of the critical evaluation of individual authors and works. And third, the overall felicity of the exposition. So I have to say that it's a very clear book, very easy to read, despite its sophistication, no? I mentioned before. I don't want to bore you with my opinions and comments. I think it will be more interesting if we listen to Cecily talking about her own book. So I have prepared some questions for her, so we can discuss a little in depth on her book. So Cecily, in page 4 of your book, you say, in my study of recent Latin American novels, I find that the region's contemporary narrative is faced with reconstructing not only local meanings, but also the very meaning of local itself. So I would like you to elaborate that, maybe give us some example so the public can have a better idea of your approach in this book.
Thank you so much, Catalina. What a pleasure to hear your thoughts on my work. And I very much appreciate your presence. Also, Marie-France, Guénette, Ingrid, hello. So many wonderful faces from across the last many years of doing research on this book. Hi, Gwen, and others. So it's such a pleasure to see all of you here. So wanted to kind of take a step back and kind of think a little bit about what local might mean within the book. So I think what I've realized within the research for this particular study is that what connects us to our local sense of a self is often less grounded in a fixed sense of place, but rather a sense of a set of experiences, of language, identity, and how we occupy the various worlds in which we live. So the local representations that are studied in the book often entail sites of tension for the remediation of identity and reckoning with ground level impacts of uneven economic development and state and interpersonal violence. So what we're seeing here is textual engagement with the simultaneity and disjuncture of globalization, which offers a vision of contemporary life that's woven from the heterogeneities and these processes of movement and communication. So really local is less about one particular place, but rather we might have multiple localities within us, right? And we travel with them. We travel with them through our language. We travel with them through the types of connections that we forge abroad. So some of the things I look at in the book include new narrative techniques of what it means to be local, right? So I look at fragments that speak from multiple voices and settings. I look at lengthy forays into memory, hybrid geographies that mingle words and syntaxes. I look at a book called Mar Paraguayo, which is by Wilson Bueno, written in Spanish and in Portuguese. So it's written in Portuñol, in fact, and it also has Guarani, which is an indigenous language in Brazil, interwoven in throughout. So really kind of looking at the ways in which language might represent a sense of a mobile spatiality, a mobile movement of our identity across space and time. So these are some of the things that I look at within the book. In the second chapter of the book, which is on Roberto Bolaño, and then a theatrical adaptation of 2666, which is the novel that I look at, I examine the use of fragmentation. So how does Bolaño perhaps use micro narratives or vignettes to capture a different sense of time, where we were perhaps lingering on a particular narrative moment, and then we're jumping and moving quickly to a completely different space in the world. So ways of operating and thinking about space and time, I think really are crucial to understanding of what it means to operate in an increasingly globalized world. And there are things that really play out across the book. In the final chapter of the book, I look at Valeria Luiselli's novel, Los Ingrávidos, or A Face in the Crowd in English. I'll try to provide English titles for those of you who are perhaps more interested in translation of these books. But I look there at how a woman moves between Mexico City and New York City, and sort of the migration journey, and how there's certain narrative techniques there that she played that really kind of are essential to that particular novel. But really, I'm looking at narrative techniques as a way of capturing our experience with an increasingly global life. And I'm doing that through local protagonists, Latin American writers, Latin American protagonists. And I'm doing that, I try to do that in Spanish and Portuguese. I think one of the challenges, and we'll talk about this perhaps later on, to the field, is that there's not a lot of, often there's a lack of bridges or dialogue between Brazilian literature and Spanish American literature. And I really am trying to see that as something that is a gap that we need to fill in the scholarship. So I hope that that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, you started talking a little about the different chapter. One of the things that I like, and you explain very well in your introduction, is that you have organized your chapters on the book thematically to illustrate those techniques you talk about just now. How you capture the dialogue between local terrains and local processes. In every of those chapters, you analyze different things. For example, the role of language as a mobile speciality, the multi-territoriality in the case of Millennium and the adaptation, the spatial ambiguity in chapter 3. And you mentioned the case of Valeria Luiselli in chapter 4, where you focus on her interest in textual practices. No, I would like to focus a little on this chapter that I like very much. This is a novel that I really like. So I would like you to explain to our audience how this novel, Los Ingrávidos, Faces in Crowd, engages with contemporary experiences by showing interest with textual practices. And how do you read in your book these different parallel but intersecting narrative realities that the author, Valeria Luiselli, creates in Los Ingrávidos?
Right. So in the final chapter of the book, I turned to a female writer. Unfortunately, there's not more of them in the book. That was a critique from a dissertation defense many, many years ago. I'm sure that some of you might recall that. So I wanted to add a young contemporary Mexican novelist to this quorum of otherwise male authors. And I think that Valeria Luiselli is exciting because she's able to really kind of use some of these techniques that I mentioned before, fragmentation, looking at also temporal jumps across space and time through kind of really operating across and between many, many different places in the novel. And also she does a wonderful job with metatextual references to other authors and other spaces and places. So she really kind of embeds herself within dialogues around world literature, really. Around authors that really kind of step outside of the Latin American canon. And in doing so, I think really allows us to see Latin American literature as part of a much more global phenomenon around ways of thinking about globalization, ways of thinking about contemporary life, ways of thinking about immigration. That novel is one that really heavily reflects upon what it means to immigrate to a particular place. But what happens when we immigrate? We don't leave behind everything that we perhaps have left. We bring it with us. We bring it with us through memory, through language, through the books that we read, through the journeys that we take within the cities that we live. And I think that these are some exciting topics that are of interest, not only within Latin American literature, but in world literature. So I hope that also answers your question, Catalina.
Yeah, so I like very much in this chapter the reflection you do on the differences between the Spanish and the English version of the novel that are very different. So maybe you can tell us something about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So the novels were meticulously read in English and in Spanish, and we noticed in those readings that some of the characters had different names, they went different places, there were certain figures that were emphasized in the English that didn't appear at all in the Spanish or vice versa. And so what it really made me think about is the idea of the localization of language and how the author was very much, I think, committed to kind of keeping with cultural norms or keeping with what she understood would be perhaps a more palatable narrative in either English or in Spanish. I've also read a little bit of critique or a little bit of sort of thoughts from Luiselli on this. And what she kind of mentioned was that she was playing a game with the reader. So for those who had read both the novels in the translation and in the original, that they would have a little bit of a hunt to kind of look through for differences between the two of them. It's also neat to think about the kind of role of the author in the translation of their fictive works, because often authors are either not involved or maybe limited involvement, but she was actively involved in that translation. And I think that she worked with a translator to really kind of capture some of those cultural nuances across the two languages. Translation studies are of increasing importance to me in my research, and I was really captivated by those somewhat nuanced differences, but I think differences that really do reflect a different type of audience, linguistic and cultural.
Thank you, Cecily. So I'm sure that since you closed your book, you have thought of many other literary works that could have been included in your book. So what text would you like to have analyzed in your book, and why? For now.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I would have loved to include more female authors. One of them that's kind of been on my mind lately is Tatyana Salem Levy. She's Brazilian, and she wrote a really wonderful text called A Chave de Casa, or in Spanish it's La Llave de la Casa, and in English it's the key to the house, or actually it's called the House in Smyrna. That's the official translation. It was actually translated into English as well. From 2013, I would have loved to include her. She also works with micro narrative. She does narrative fragments. I would have loved to also look at Patricio Pron, who's an Argentine writer, contemporary, and a novel that he wrote called El Espíritu de mis Padres sigue subiendo en la lluvia from 2011. I would have also liked to look a little bit more at Valeria's more recent work from 2019, the Lost Children Archive, and also Edmundo Pastodan's Norte from 2016 as well, which looks at the border space. There's just so much that could have been done, and that hopefully will be done one day by all of us who are committed to this work. Another novel that came to mind in terms of just in critical importance in thinking about migration in borderlands is Antonio Ortuño's La Fila India from 2013. So these are some things that I would have appreciated the ability to talk about, but maybe there'll be a sequel to this book. No, just kidding.
You can write a second part of the book, maybe.
We'll see.
So I have another question, but I think that maybe Leila can start, so I don't. You can go, Leila. If at the end we have time, I can go with more questions.
Thank you, Catalina. And thank you so much, Cecily, for allowing me to be part of this event. Thank you also, Ingrid and Marie-France. It's really an honor and such a delight to be here talking about this book that, as Catalina said, is absolutely marvelous. I do not speak French, I apologize, so I will make my remarks primarily in English, unless you want me to speak in Portuguese, which I can do as well. But I think English is probably more the common denominator in this case. So Catalina said most of the things I wanted to say about the book in terms of its contributions. I think it's a really important addition to the study of Latin American literature, Latin American, including Brazil. Book you really have this inclusive view of Latin America, I think really adds to the global aspect of the book as much as the local, because there is also local dynamics to Brazilian literature per se, and I will get back to this. I really also appreciated the attention that you pay to the power dynamics between the global and the local, and it's not a facile attention, so it's not a simple denigration of globalization, as we see many times, or on the other hand, an idealization of globalization as, opening of borders, flux of people, flux of goods, flux of culture, et cetera, but really showing the back and forth that globalization implies, both in terms of the global and the local, but also in terms of the power dynamics and how literature negotiates those tensions. I think it's a very, very complex analysis that you perform through literature of these multiple structures and, power plays that are in place in the region, and more broadly speaking, of course, And I really found your attention to the diverse aspects of how literature engages with the tension between the global and the local, very intriguing. So, you know, how you really are able to tease out how literature uses certain tropi or themes to speak about these tensions, you know, so language, translation implicitly as well, etc. And I also, you know, I so enjoyed reading your book also because you are such a careful and insightful textual reader, right? You really go into the fabric of the text. You don't gloss over, you really take apart language and look into the little details and what that means, right? So it was really, I think it's a book that I would recommend my students to read to really see how they should be doing textual analysis, okay? So congratulations again. And I have, you know, as any good book, your book elicited many questions for me. I think that's the function of good books. And so I was wondering if you could tell me or tell us a little bit more about how you see the tension between the global and the local playing out in more recent Latin American literature. So your book goes until about 2011, right? And I was wondering this, especially because there is a little bit of a shift in the global dynamics of economic power. So China is more and more an important player in the region. And, you know, there's also, you speak, you know, you do an excellent job in contextualizing the book in this, you know, democratization and the pink tide. But as you know, there has been a resurgence of neo-authoritarian and nationalist rhetoric. And with that, also an accompanying anti-globalist rhetoric from various sectors of society. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, you know, about how you see these dynamics impacting Latin American literature that deal with the topics that you work with in your book.
Thank you so much, Leila. It's such a pleasure to have you as part of this event as a discussant. I've long admired your work. I got to know you when I was at an event when I was in Brasilia many years ago, and it's such a great thing that you're here, and such a great thing to be able to discuss this book with you. Your comments on the book mean so much to me because I just value your opinion so highly. I wanted to go ahead and jump into kind of thinking about some of these newer novels, these newer works. It would seem to me that the tension between the local and the global has only heightened in the post-2011 literary landscape and really political and cultural and economic landscape of Latin America. The rise of neo-authoritarian regimes, and as you mentioned, the accompanying nationalist rhetoric is certainly you know, ever present, and it's only on the rise. So literature reminds us, though, that local actors and forces seem to provide some sense of resilience, opening up spaces for new types of conversations, for new connections. And I think, you know, when we see kind of the more contemporary attempts at looking at some of these questions, there seems to be a deep interest in border spaces and migration, and in this the turbulence of the post-2011 world, right? I mentioned earlier authors like Ortuño, Mundo Paso del Norte, Patricio Pron. I'm also thinking about authors like Julian Fuchs, looking at resistance. I think about authors that also write online. I'm thinking of Luis Correa Diaz, who writes a lot of sort of digital poetry. So there seems to be attempts to kind of bridge the gap between or kind of look at what these questions mean in the sort of digital space as well. So new territories of belonging, there seems to be a renewed focus on transnational bonds in the face of displacement, de- and re-territorialization, migration, as we head further into the 21st century. These territories play out in cultural production through, as I mentioned, forays into memory, language. But literature provides opportunities for understanding how to forge connections despite the intense disconnection of contemporary life. This also plays out, as I mentioned, in the digital sphere, as we see folks gathering around shared interests, including identity and language groups, despite being disparately located and distant from one another. at the same time, the very technology that connects us also disconnects us, reminding us that the human touch and interaction can't be replaced, and that we might provide temporary shelter within the digital, but we cannot really serve, it doesn't really serve as a sustaining force. So some of the more recent contemporary works online have really been of great interest to me. And I'll mention that as we kind of transition perhaps into some of the other questions for today. But so really, I think, looking at some of the more recent scholarship, again, Julian Fuchs, I'm thinking of Tatyana and Levy, I'm thinking of others. And I also wanted to mention that these questions are only increasing, right? So I think there's a renewed focus on the local, if nothing else. People are very obsessed with like local identities, where they're from, where we go from here, right? Especially during the pandemic, we're all very much, we're forced to be local, right? We're forced to be trapped in our homes, depending on how you look at that. So I think there will be a really interesting writing emerging out of this pandemic period. And I think it'll really kind of capture what it means to operate between these two different spheres. One thing that you mentioned, which I thought was particularly fascinating, Leila, was the impact of China as a global superpower on the region. And I think, kind of thinking about what the Cold War period, which really, my book kind of starts at the end of that and kind of comes up to 2011. But I think we're seeing new global forces that are really, at play here, right? We're seeing, and a really intense intervention of China in the region, both economically, but also socially and culturally. And I think that will certainly manifest in writing to come. But I still have my questions as to how that'll happen. But yeah, I think it might happen in many different ways, online and also in the analog space.
Thanks, Cecily. With China, I was thinking specifically of the books by Ricardo Lisias and Bernardo Carvalho that have two books that deal with the, the influence of China in Brazil. So if you don't mind, I have a couple of other questions that I would like to ask, Sure.
I also wanted to mention there's one novel that I didn't get a chance to mention earlier by César Aida called Una novela china. So there appears to be from the 90s up until the present day, maybe perhaps an increased interest and attention to detail as it relates to China, the sort of involvement and impact of China on the region. But yeah, I'd love to study that a little bit more. Thank you.
So going into a more detailed level of the book itself, this was the first question was a little bit more of a general question. On page 11 of the book, you state, and I'm going to quote from your book here, as local authors embedded in global processes, the protagonists of contemporary Latin American literature must inaugurate new territories of belonging, whether in response to the disorientation of living in foreign locales or the alienating experience of confronting world events and phenomena in local spaces. And the quote ends there. And my question then is, could you explain what these new territories are and how they have changed in the last decade?
Right, so I think, again, unhinging place or unhinging a particular experience with place or space from identity is really crucial to understanding some of these new territories. So again, our ability to move across temporalities, our ability to deal with phenomenological forces that might be out of our control, but we're kind of really kind of focused on as contemporary humans in the world. I think that's where some of these new territories are emerging. I think we can see these in kind of interactions between protagonists. If we look at the level of the texts, I think we can see this also in interactions between the digital and the analog, as I mentioned earlier. I think these new territories are also emerging in ways that are multifaceted and are not often very even. One of the biggest things that I tried to argue in this book was that globalization is far from a flat process. There's in the world, the world is not flat, as Friedman may have argued many years ago, but rather is uneven, is textured, is layered, and is something that it may come at us in a wave and then kind of be sort of invisible or omnipresent, but yet we're not able to see the things that are impacting our lives from a global perspective. So I think that literature has the power of showing us some of those textures, of showing us some of those ways in which we're able to connect with one another despite extreme difficulties, whether they're economic, social, political, and also despite the fact that, you know, we might be feeling incredibly disconnected when we think about our interactions with technology, our interactions with the ways in which we kind of figure out what it means to work, what it means to live in this 2021 world in which we are deeply embedded at this point. Yeah. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you. Do I have time for one more question? Okay, so I, you know, as a Brazilianist, I have to ask this question, right? Your book includes Brazilian literature in the debate of the tensions provoked by globalization in Latin America. And I was very curious to know what, if any, you know, are the differences between Brazilian and Spanish American texts when dealing with these tensions.
Mm-hmm. I love that question, Leila. I just love that question. Maybe this is the sort of bridge builder in me that really loves that. I know that you do the same. You also work with Spanish American and Brazilian texts, so I think we share that interest. So, you know, from a phenomenological level, right? All Latin Americans have been impacted by forces related to the ills of neoliberal reform, the aftermath of authoritarian regimes, and the loss of faith in the nation state as both real and conceptual frameworks for social well-being, diminished faith in state institutions. So if anything, it would appear that viewing Brazilian and Spanish American works in tandem, in conversation with one another, in dialogue, provides deep lessons on a need for more bridges and intersections between and across these two parts of Latin America. So if we look at the isolation of much of the work we do in academia between Brazil and Spanish America, the fact that we often shy away from such dialogue really needs to be addressed, I think. It's something that I'm really committed to in my work. So whether I see major differences in the ways in which these tensions are dealt with, to go back to your original question, I think my answer would actually be no. I think I would see a lot more similarities and a lot more intersections than I would in differences. I am interested, however, though, in the rise of Bolsonaro right now and what the impact that will have on the cultural production of Brazil, and how you know, some of those conversations might shift. One of the things that I wanted to mention was that in my next project, my hope is to look at like sort of digital neo-populist rhetoric within WhatsApp messages as a form of cultural production. So I'm really interested in thinking about ways of understanding this period in Brazil, and also thinking about cultural production in a more flexible way. So sort of beyond just literature in its more traditional form, so books and you know, online and offline, but rather thinking about what happens when people write stories in applications, what happens when they use social media, what happens when they interact with all of these things at our fingertips, and what does that maybe tell us about some of these same tensions that the book explores? So those are some questions that I have, yeah.
Great, I really look forward to reading your new project as well, because I mean, some of the questions you bring up are also very much of interest to me. I think I'm going to, you know, jogar a bola de volta to Catalina, since I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Thank you, Leila.
Okay, thank you, Leila. Yeah, I have another question. I mean, when we were talking, preparing today's session, this was a question that both Leila and I have. So I'm interested in your book. You talk about the tension, the dialectic between the global and the local. And you don't talk about the nation, the national literature, the condition of the nation. How do you see that, the condition, the post-national condition, the national condition in Latin American literature today?
Yeah, you know, it wouldn't be a Zoom event if we all didn't do it once, right? That's that mute issue. Thank you, Catalina. Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think that's something that was deeply embedded in the very heart of this project from the get-go. In fact, my original thought was to look at transnational sort of aesthetics within contemporary Latin American literature, and it really did make a huge shift throughout my research and my time working with this book. So it would seem that regional authors are maybe stepping further into regional and local identity, where connections are based on experiences related to local experience, right? So we can turn to authors, including Brazilian author Luis Ufato. His 5-part series, Inferno Provisorio, is a great example of this, as it charts generations of Italian immigrants to Brazil, or Elisera Muitos Carvalhos, which looks deeply at the life in São Paulo across 24-hour period. I wanted to plug really quickly Leila's event on this. You can look on her social media at Brown University. They're going to be doing a launch, I think, of the 20th year of There Were Many Horses, Elisera Muitos Carvalhos. So we can also look at works by, I mentioned Julian Fuchs, including Resistance, or Alexandre Vidal Porto, Sergio Y, or collections on the city, cities such as Rio, Reading the City, in which short story writers such as Milton Hatum, Tatyana Salem Levy, and Fehez, and others explore local encounters with the city. So this leads us to thinking that the local and the global continue to be gravitational pools, though they are frequently decentered and unhinged, making their distinctions not always noticeable. We can actively see this, for example, as I mentioned in There Were Many Horses, though in early texts within the 21st century, the local and the global are often intertwined to a degree through references to global spaces, to references to global, to sort of global illusions that make the distinction often difficult and at times futile, this distinction between local and global. So globalization would appear an uneven and heterogeneous process rather than one that is monolithic, as I discussed throughout the book. So where does the national fit into this? I think we're increasingly interested, in fact, in the local or the global, not as a counterpoint to the national, but as something that perhaps is exciting us in a way that is compelling authors to write about very local experiences. And I've seen less reflection on national identity. Others in the crowd are very much experts on this as well, so feel free to step in. But I think there seems to be more of an interest in city life and sort of local expressions of life, and as those sort of relate to global phenomenological forces, rather than thinking about an obsession with sort of national literature, national life. That's my observation so far.
Okay, thank you so much, Cecily. I don't know if we should, we have already spent almost 15 minutes. Should we let the public ask question now? Lidia?
Oh, Lydia, you can feel free to go ahead and just jump right in, Lydia, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can ask the question. Thank you for that presentation, Cecily, and congratulations. I think this is a wonderful event and a wonderful book, and I know the product of a very long process of work, so congratulations. And so we have one question from Marie-France, and I was wondering if, Cecily, you could speak a little about the ties between identity, language, and place. For instance, did you notice any changes in the characters' identities as they migrated?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Marie-France, for that question. I wanted to just take a moment to think about some of these protagonists, because there's so many of them. In the first chapter, there's Luis Ufato's novel, his short novel, Estive em Lisboa e lembrei de você, so I was in Lisbon, I remembered you. I also look at, I mentioned Mar Paraguayo. There's a Paraguayan prostitute in that particular text. And in the case of I was in Lisbon, I remembered you, we have a migrant that goes from Brazil to Lisbon and spends a period of time there and gets deeply kind of connected to his communities, his Brazilian transnational comrades, compatriots, pardon me, in Lisbon. In the case of the second chapter with Bolaño, we have so many protagonists that it wouldn't even be worth sort of mentioning all of them right now, because there's just a myriad of them, but they're really traveling across many places and spaces. We have everything from sort of the femicides of the border space between Juarez and El Paso, and then we also have protagonists that are cosmopolitan academics traveling across Europe and North America. And then in the third chapter, we have two novels that look at the sort of ruinous spaces of sort of ambiguous novels, two that are related to migration. So we have a number of migrants in that third chapter. And then finally, in the last chapter, we have a young woman who's a translator, who is a writer, who is really looking for the traces of a Mexican writer in New York. So we have such a wide variety of voices and stories. And so with regard to your question, Marifans, I think what we're looking at with this tie between identity, language, and place is that these things are so incredibly malleable, and they do change as we move. They change very much with regard to who we're coming in contact with, what our experience looks like as we move across space and time, the people that we interact with. But what's really neat to me is that many things also stay the same, right? Many things also really do deeply embed us in our own personal sense of self, our own personal identity, and who we are and where we came from. Those things seem to be really the anchors of this otherwise very movable and kind of fluid space interaction with global life. So there are anchors there. And I think one of the most interesting things to me was how much language was an anchor. I think we've all experienced that. So here in Montreal, I'm from the United States, I'm from the Midwest. I speak Midwestern English. I have a few sort of Canadianisms that have come over space and time after 6 years here. I learned Spanish in Chile, so I have a little bit of a Chilean dialect going on. I learned Brazilian Portuguese in Brasilia, and I'm learning French as you know, one of a few languages. So you know, the way that we speak reflects who we are, it reflects our history, our past, the ways in which we interacted and contacted other people. And I think that's very present in the book. That's something that's really exciting about thinking about language as a mobile spatiality, something that moves with us. And I know that we all have had those experiences, which I think is really an exciting and wonderful thing to think about. So rather than seeing perhaps an accent as being a marker of foreignness or otherness, perhaps it's a marker of courage and identity, something that really does connect us with who we are. As I move more into multilingual projects, I'm really interested in multilingual digital humanities. I'm really excited about the idea that perhaps we could, you know, do something to fight the dominance of the Anglophone world in which academia very much around which academia revolves at the level of publications, at the level of research, and at the level of funding. Perhaps we can fund multilingual projects. Perhaps we can do things that lie outside of even the Indo-European bubble, right? So that lie outside of some of the languages that I'm studying and perhaps delve into other territories. I hope that was helpful, Marifans, yeah.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from Kate Bundy. She says, I'm wondering if your book touches on fears of globalization as a homogenizing phenomenon, and if localisms respond to that through literary production.
Kate, thank you so much for that question. I think that's precisely what the book is trying to do. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So really it's trying to kind of dismantle the homogenization and the flattening processes that are so sort of associated with globalization theory, and trying to explore ways in which local lives and really operate within these global contexts. And by the way, I wanted to mention that global isn't just going somewhere else. It isn't just you know, moving. Global happens to us where we are in our very homes. If we think about Zoom as a global experience, we think about the fact that it's really situated in Silicon Valley, and that we're operating with the global in every interaction, and that our data is being stored on some, you know, server in Northern California. What I wanted to really emphasize is that globalization is something that comes to our homes. It comes to every aspect of our lives, and it's something that really kind of carries into other spaces and places. So we don't have to be a cosmopolitan traveler to live a globalized life. In fact, we're all living them right now, I think. So yes, Kate, that's a really wonderful way of seeing the book. And I think that's exactly the type of work that the book is trying to do.
Thank you. We currently don't have any other questions. So please, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and write them in the chat. I think we maybe have time for one last question, or yeah.
Sure. We could also take a live question if anybody wants to just ask something.
Mm-hmm.
Cecily, I'm sorry. So one question I had for you is, you know, I also know some of your work in the digital humanities, and you kind of touched a little bit, you know, you gave us a little bit of a flavor of how this work might intersect with the research you did in your book. But I was wondering if you could kind of tell us if there is, what are the intersections between, you know, the research you do in their book and your work on the digital humanities?
Sure, thank you so much, Leila. So really, I think some of the same questions on place and space, on language communities and territories of belonging are really ever present in the digital sphere. So much like the analog sphere, the digital space is full of textures, incongruencies, and holes. But it's also a place for connection and community building. So within the areas of digital humanities and Latin American literature and cultural studies, I've developed an interdisciplinary approach to examining cultural responses to globalization. So these responses can take the form of how web readership evolves on the basis of a shared language community, the role of place and space in national newspapers, pardon me. I became completely obsessed with perhaps thinking about national newspapers as a space for cultural production and what that means to kind of write within a national newspaper in terms of thinking about nation, or even modes of belonging that manifest in online and offline literary writing. So really at the heart of my scholarship is an attention to contemporary cultural products, be they textual or visual, analog or digital. And I'm also cognizant of the parameters of culture span from canonical novels to Twitter fiction and memes. And I'm also committed to expanding what it means to produce culture and to giving space and voices to artists, writers, bloggers, and poets on the periphery of my fields. As we step further into the 21st century, we're really progressively obliged to move outside of the sanctioned and sanitized walls of the academy. I know that you do that very much in your own work, Leila, and into halls of chat rooms, web forums, and comment sections, which I call the digital back alleys with their own forms of expression, in order to interrogate some of these expressions of contemporary life. As a region known for its diversity and multilingualism, Latin America provides ample case studies for lessons on local and global that supersede geographical parameters, both online and offline. So that's some of the things that I've been working on in terms of thinking about intersections between my sort of work within this particular book and the next projects. So in terms of next projects, after spending the last few years dedicated to more traditional forms of cultural production, such as novels, plays, microfiction, short stories, blog posts, and literary content in national newspapers and this trans-Hispanic blog, in my future work, I would like to expand to platforms and formats that are more mobile, flexible, and non-traditional. With this in mind, it's my hope to extend some of my work on language communities, digital selves, and the construction of national identity by looking at cultural production through mobile devices. I mentioned WhatsApp, but really mobile devices broadly understood. So I'm currently preparing, my next project is called Narrating the Self in Latin America, Digital Practice, Public Space, and Mobile Identities. In this new research, I would like to examine the arena of mobile devices and the cultural landscapes of the region as an emerging and critical line of inquiry in the global South. One of the things that's really neat to me is just how much contact we have with culture through our mobile devices. And if we think about the fact that most Latin Americans, and I'll stress this, have only ever accessed the web through their mobile devices. That's important. That's a really important detail. Pardon me, not a detail, it's a really important thing. Because if we're looking at something through a mobile screen, we're interacting with that content in a different way. So how does culture and how do literary and fictive attempts at producing and expressing ourselves, producing culture and expressing ourselves play out within this mobile sphere? These are some questions that I have for the future projects that I'm working on.
Well, thank you everyone for these lovely questions. Lydia, I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
No, that's fine. We don't have any more questions, so I think we are ready to wrap up.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Merci encore d'avoir participé en grand nombre. Cecily, as you can see, you have a vast crew of people who are looking forward to reading both this book and the future books and publications. So we'll be looking out for your further incoming projects. So congratulations again on this lovely publication, and we look forward to discussing it further. I am sure that Cecily will be accepting questions through email, so feel free to reach out to her for that, or again on Twitter, and we can keep the discussion going. And as you read the book, maybe you can tweet some of your thoughts in public tweets to Cecily, so that we can all jump in and exchange on these topics. So I don't know if you're seeing this, Cecily, in the chat. Everybody's congratulating you. Kate Bundy is asking if there's a link to purchase the book. So Cecily, maybe you can tell us a little bit where the book is accessible.
Absolutely. I'm actually going to turn back to Ingrid for that. I think that she'll have some closing remarks as well, and also talk about.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just in the middle of mommy duty at the same time. My girls just got here, so I was hearing as much as I could just for the last. Yeah, actually, it's at the Le James bookstore at McGill that you can purchase it, right, Cecily? But anyway, I'll probably let Cecily be clarify that a little bit more. But I just want to say that's a lovely event. So many of the books that you mentioned are actually potential. Julian Fuchs was going to be here last year. You know, so many of the names. Tatyana, Levy also I love. You know, it was just fun to see like a scholarly discussion as I'm thinking about programming. So Cecily, here's to working together. You know, for next year. Mama, actually, wait, baby. I'm hungry. Okay, Mama, in a second. And anyway, Cecily, we're delighted again to have you to have done this event. I hope you had a good time in your launch, and hoping that next year we could do you know, we could do something live with a glass of wine or something. And on that note, I was gonna ask if anybody has a glass of wine, you know, to cheer. That would be really nice. I'm good. Look, to raise a glass. Mine is anyway. I'll do it with water. Okay, well, okay, baby.
I wanted to actually just mention quickly in terms of the book purchases. So it's available at Le James, which is of course McGill's bookstore. It's also available. I think we have a link in the chat. So it's available through Bucknell University Press, which is the press that published the book. And they work with Rutgers for distribution. There's a link there in the chat, so you guys can actually purchase it directly from the publisher. And then you can also purchase it on various online venues as well. So I wanted to just express a final note of incredible gratitude for today. I know that 6 o'clock is a difficult time for a lot of parents, and I thank you, Ingrid. I know that you have 2 daughters, so my little guy is with a babysitter. So wanted to just express a deep note of gratitude to everyone involved, and it's been such a pleasure to be able to discuss my work with you all. And so I'll just wanted to say that before we wrap up, and I'll maybe turn back to Marie-France.
So congratulations again. Someone mentioned in the chat that so Ninos just said that he's really looking forward to hearing about the intersection between culture and mobile devices in your research. So yeah, I mean, everyone knows we're all on Zoom, on our phones, on computers, anything. So there's probably going to be a resurgence of e-lit and all sorts of kinds of literature that we don't even know that exist. So here's to discovering new intersections between different kinds of literature. If that's all, then I wish everyone a lovely evening. Passez une très belle soirée. Merci encore de votre participation et félicitations encore, Cecily, and looking forward to future events.
Congratulations, Cecily.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Parabéns e obrigada, Cecily.
Muito obrigada, Leila. Até a próxima.
Parabéns, parabéns com felicidades.
Muito obrigada, Ingrid. Thank you so much. Thank you. Merci.